Welcome to English Stories with Dr. K.
Rowing the Bus by Paul Logan. When I was in elementary school, some older kids made me row the bus. Rowing meant that on the way to school, I had to sit in the dirty bus aisle littered with paper, gum wads, and spitballs. Then I had to simulate the motion of rowing while the kids around me laughed and chanted, "Row, row, row the bus." I was forced to do this by a group of bullies who spent most of their time picking on me. I was the perfect target for them. I was small, I had no father, and my mother, though she worked hard to support me, was unable to afford clothes and sneakers that were cool. Instead, she dressed me in outfits that we got from the bags, hand-me-downs, given as donations to a local church. Each Wednesday, she'd bring several bags of clothes to the house and pull out musty, wrinkled shirts and worn bell-bottom pants that other families no longer wanted. I knew that people were kind to give things to us, but I hated wearing clothes that might have been donated by my classmates. Each time I wore something from the bags, I feared that the other kids might recognize something that was once theirs. Besides my outdated clothes, I wore thick glasses, had crossed eyes, and spoke with a persistent lisp. For whatever reason, I had never learned to say the S sound properly, and I pronounced words that began with TH as if they began with a D. In addition, because of my severely crossed eyes, I lacked the hand and eye coordination necessary to hit or catch flying objects. As a result, footballs, baseballs, soccer balls, and basketballs became my enemies. I knew before I stepped on the field or court that I would do something clumsy or foolish, and that everyone would laugh at me. I feared humiliation so much that I became skillful at feigning illnesses to get out of gym class. Eventually, I learned how to give myself low-grade fevers so the nurse would write me an excuse. It worked for a while, until the gym teachers caught on. When I did have to play, I was always the last one chosen to be on any team. In fact, team captains did everything in their power to make their opponents get stuck with me. When the unlucky team captain was forced to call my name, I would trudge over to the team, knowing that no one there liked or wanted me. For 4 years, from 2nd through 5th grade, I prayed nightly for God to give me school days in which I would not be insulted, embarrassed, or made to feel ashamed. I thought my prayers were answered when my mother decided to move during the summer before 6th grade. The movement meant that I got to start 6th grade in a different school, a place where I had no reputation. Although the older kids laughed and snorted at me as soon as I got on my new bus, they couldn't miss my thick glasses and strange clothes. I soon discovered there was another kid who received the brunt of their insults. His name was George, and everyone made fun of him. The kids taunted him because he was skinny. They belittled him because he had acne that pocked and blotched his face, and they teased him because his voice was squeaky. During my first gym class at my new school, I wasn't the last one chosen for kickball. George was. George tried hard to be friends with me, coming up to me in the cafeteria on the first day of school. "Hi, my name's George. Can I sit with you?" he asked, with a peculiar squeakiness that made each word high-pitched and raspy. As I nodded for him to sit down, I noticed an uncomfortable silence in the cafeteria as many of the students who had mocked George's clumsy gait during gym class began watching the two of us and whispering among themselves. By letting him sit with me, I had violated an unspoken law of school a sinister code of childhood that demands there must always be someone to pick on. I began to realize two things. If I befriended George, I would soon receive the same treatment that I had gotten at my old school. If I stayed away from him, I might actually have a chance to escape being at the bottom. Within days, the kids started taunting us whenever we were together. "Who's your new little buddy, Georgie?" In the hallways, groups of students began mumbling about me, just loud enough for me to hear. "Look, it's George's ugly boyfriend." On the bus rides to and from school, wads of paper and wet chewing gum were tossed at me by the bigger, older kids in the back of the bus. It became clear that my friendship with George was going to cause me several more years of misery at my new school. I decided to stop being friends with George. In class and at lunch, I spent less and less time with him. Sometimes I told him I was too busy to talk. Other times I acted distracted and gave one-word responses to whatever he said. Our classmates, sensing that they had created a rift between George and me, intensified their attacks on him. Each day, George grew more desperate as he realized that the one person who could prevent him from being completely isolated was closing him off. I knew that I shouldn't avoid him, that he was feeling the same way I felt for so long. But I was so afraid that my life would become the hell it had been in my old school that I continued to ignore him. Then at recess one day, the meanest kid in the school, Chris, decided he had had enough of George. He vowed that he was going to beat up George and anyone else who claimed to be his friend. A mob of kids formed and came after me. Chris led the way and cornered me near our school swing sets. He grabbed me by my shirt and raised his fist over my head. A huge gathering of kids surrounded us, urging him to beat me up, chanting, "Go, Chris, go!" "You're Georgie's new little boyfriend, aren't you?" Chris asked. The hot blast of his breath carried droplets of his spit into my face. In a complete betrayal of the only kid who was nice to me, I denied George's friendship. "No, I'm not George's friend. I don't like him. He's stupid," I blurted out. Several kids snickered and mumbled under their breath. Chris stared at me for a few seconds and then threw me to the ground. "Wimp, where's George?" he demanded, standing over me. Someone pointed to George sitting alone on top of the monkey bars about 30 yards from where we were. He was watching me. Chris and his followers sprinted over to George and yanked him off the bars to the ground. Although the mob quickly encircled them, I could still see the two of them at the center of the crowd, looking at each other. George seemed stoic, staring straight through Chris. I heard the familiar chant of, "Go, Chris, go," and watched as his fists began slamming into George's head and body. His face bloodied and his nose broken, George crumpled to the ground and sobbed without ever throwing a punch. The mob cheered with pleasure and darted off into the playground to avoid an approaching teacher. Chris was suspended, and after a few days, George came back to school. I wanted to talk to him, to ask him how he was, to apologize for leaving him alone and for not trying to stop him from getting hurt. But I couldn't go near him. Filled with shame for denying George and angered by my own cowardice, I never spoke to him again. Several months later, without telling any students, George transferred to another school. Once in a while, in those last weeks before he left, I caught him watching me as I sat with the rest of the kids in the cafeteria. He never yelled at me or expressed anger, disappointment, or even sadness. Instead, he just looked at me. In the years that followed, George's silent stare remained with me. It was there in 8th grade when I saw a gang of popular kids beat up a 6th grader because they said he was ugly and stupid. It was there my first year in high school when I saw a group of older kids steal from another freshman's clothes and throw them into the shower. It was there a year later when I watched several seniors press a wad of chewing gum into the hair of a new girl on the bus. Each time that I witnessed another awkward, uncomfortable, scared kid being tormented, I thought of George, and gradually his haunting stare began to speak to me. No longer silent, it told me that every child who is picked on and taunted deserves better, that no one, no matter how big, strong, attractive, or popular, has the right to abuse another person. Finally, in my junior year, when a loudmouth, pink-skinned bully named Donald began picking on 2 freshmen in the bus, I could no longer deny George. Donald was crumpling a large wad of paper and preparing to bounce it off the back of the head of one of the young students when I interrupted him. "Leave him alone, Don," I said. By then, I was 6 inches taller, and after 2 years of high school wrestling, 30 pounds heavier than I had been in my freshman year. Though Donald was still 2 years older than me, he wasn't much bigger. He stopped what he was doing, squinted, and stared at me. "What's your problem, Paul?" I felt the way I had many years earlier on the playground when I watched the mob of kids began to surround George. "Just leave them alone. They aren't bothering you," I responded quietly. "What's it to you?" he challenged. A glimpse of my own past of rowing the bus, of being mocked for my clothes, my lisp, my glasses, and my absent father flashed in my mind. Just don't mess with them. That's all I'm saying, Don. My fingertips were tingling. The bus was silent. He got up from his seat and leaned over me, and I rose from my seat to face him. For a minute, both of us just stood there, without a word, staring. "I'm just playing with them, Paul," he said, chuckling. "You don't have to go psycho on me or anything." Then he shook his head, slapped me firmly on the chest with the back of his hand, and sat down, but he never threw that wad of paper. For the rest of the year, whenever I was on the bus, Don and the other troublemakers were noticeably quiet. Although it has been years since my days on the playground and the school bus, George's look still haunts me today. Today I see it on the faces of a few scared kids at my sister's school. She is in 5th grade. Or once in a while I'll catch a glimpse of someone like George on the evening news in a story about a child who brought a gun to school to stop the kids from picking on him, or in a feature about a teenager who killed herself because everyone teased her. In each school, in almost every classroom, there is a George with a stricken face, hoping that someone nearby will be strong enough to be kind despite what the crowd says, and brave enough to stand up against what people who attack, tease, or hurt those who are vulnerable. If asked about their behavior, I'm sure the bullies would say, "What's it to you? It's just a joke. It's nothing." But to George and me, and everyone else who has been humiliated or laughed at or spat on, it is everything. No one should have to row the bus.
Please subscribe, like, and share.